Hello lovely friends, I hope you're well. You're very welcome here as ever, and of course I'm here today to talk about books. I feel like I haven't done a sit down video like this in a really long time. I've been putting off this video as ever because I hate doing wrap-ups because I have to contend with my own memory and it doesn't work. So I've literally been sitting here reading my notes about the 7 books that I read last month, and I'm like, who wrote that? Who is she? Who was she? But yeah, we're gonna truck along anyway, and I'll do my best, but I'm making no promises as ever. The first book that I read in October was, of course, The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. See, I've already forgotten who wrote the book. So this is actually a really interesting book. You can see how it was definitely influenced a lot by Jane Eyre. I know that I read Jane Eyre, but technically I didn't finish it because I did it in school. I studied it in school for English, but I do know the story, thankfully, so there were no spoilers. But before I get into what this book is about, I would say do be careful, just in case it might reference Jane Eyre a little bit too much and spoil 1 or 2 things for you. I actually can't remember because it's been over a month since I read this book, so I don't know if there are spoilers for Jane Eyre or not, but just in case, don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, so we follow a girl named Margaret Lee, one of those. She's a young woman who's grown up with both of her parents in England. Her mother is very distant and we don't really know why, but she's kind of got this nice relationship with her dad. So she's grown up primarily with her dad, and her dad runs this bookshop. Her dad specializes in a lot of kind of rare books and things like that, and then the bookshop is just kind of what keeps them going on the side. So Margaret has found not only a love of reading from spending so much time in this bookshop, but also a love of writing. Specifically, she has written quite a few biographies on dead people, and that seems to be her niche. Look girl, you do you, Margaret. Sorry, I got distracted. My little doggy wanted to get down off the bed and she wasn't able, so yours truly had to help. But yes, so Margaret is fond of writing historical biographies for people who have passed. She is toddling along about her day-to-day life, and she receives this letter from this really infamous author in this world whose name is Vida Winter, and Vida Winter asks Margaret if she would be willing to write her biography, which is unusual for 2 reasons, because Margaret has never written a biography for a living person, and the other reason is because Vida Winter is one of these really infamous authors who nobody really knows anything about, because when she does interviews and is asked questions about her own life, she is infamous for lying, but she promises Margaret that she will actually give her the truth. Vida asks Margaret to travel to her home and to stay with her while she's writing this biography, and Margaret is a little bit unsure for both of the reasons that I've mentioned above, and she just doesn't know if Vida is actually going to give her the truth, and she doesn't want to be lied to. She doesn't want the truth to be misconstrued. She wants to tell an accurate story. So anyway, she decides, right, I'll travel along and see what this woman has to say. And Vida tells this story. It's about her own very unusual and strange upbringing in the famous Angelfield house that was ruined in a fire many years prior to Margaret meeting Vida. Vida tells this story of her family, and it's really strange and bewitching and bewildering as well. Her parents were mostly absent, and she grew up in this really insular world in this house amongst the staff of the house, where her parents were just not really present, and herself and her twin learned by themselves kind of how to navigate the world. As the years move on, the staff move on into different jobs because they're not getting paid and so on and so forth. The 2 twins live this very lonely childhood, void of contact with pretty much anybody. It's really strange in many ways. It's a really gothic tale as well, which I loved. And as I mentioned, it's really heavily influenced by Jane Eyre as well. It's not the same story, don't worry, but there are certainly a lot of references in there. It took me a long time to read this book, and not because I wasn't enjoying it. It was just one I kind of wanted to take my time with. It's really character driven, really quite slow as well, but not frustratingly so in my opinion. But if you're somebody who likes a much more plot driven book, I would say maybe stay away from this one. That said, I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it if you're somebody who really likes a character driven novel. And it's not too long. It is coming in at 456 pages, so middle ground. Okay, then the next book that I read in October, I keep going to say November because today is 9th of November, so I'm like, October, who is she? But the next book then was one that I've been really looking forward to for a really long time, and the lovely Maddie from As Told by Maddie actually sent me this, and this book is, of course, We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So this book, quite short, really quick read, a really compulsive read for me. I flew through it, I really loved it. I read The Haunting of Hill House, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. It doesn't matter. I read it and I loved it. And this book, while very different, felt like it was written by the same author. Just really loved the sharp writing style, the idea of a family kind of being in this home and for the home to be the real setting for the book. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we follow Mericat, and she lives in a house with her sister Constance and her uncle Julian. And 7 Blackwoods actually used to live in this house, but now there are only 3 of them, so 4 of them were killed after eating a dinner prepared by Constance. They were poisoned, and everybody suspects that it was Constance. Constance has been acquitted, but the people in the town are like, this girl poisoned her family and she got away with it. And so they are essentially ostracized. They live a really independent life. Mericat travels into town once a week to pick up some groceries, kind of has a really tough time, which actually I found really sad, because Mericat's a really young girl and her family has died and everybody's kind of mean to her, which, you know, is not nice. But look, it's just a story, I keep telling myself, but also it reminds me that sometimes people aren't very nice, are they? The interactions between the characters in this story are really strange, sometimes feel really dreamlike, and a lot of the things that transpire in this book also felt really dreamlike, and the ending was so unusual that it felt like something, again, that could have been pulled from somebody's sleep mind. I loved how the house really felt like such an important character in this novel. If you've been here for a while, you know I love a book set in a house or a building or an institution or something of the sort, where that building is really very much part of the story, to the point that it almost feels like a character. And if you're somebody who loves that kind of niche, this one has got you. Shirley Jackson's writing, like, chef's kiss. Beautiful. The pacing was really good. The plotting is amazing. The characters are just really strange, but like in an interesting, really good way. So would 100% recommend this one. Like, just give it a go. It's really short, definitely worth your time. It is a modern classic. Don't let the fact that it's classic put you off, because it kind of reads very contemporary in many ways, is very accessible. So yes, do read it. Thanks again to Maddie for passing this on to me. It was really good. Okay, so the next read for me then in October was actually really an impulse buy for me, and it was the first impulse buy, now I will say, for me in quite some time. I was buying A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid, and I had come across this book somewhere along the lines on social media, some kind of booktube, bookstagram, one of the above, and somebody had compared it to Normal People, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna buy that and I'm gonna read that. And so I did. I bought it and I read it, and it was Talking at Night by Claire Daverly, one of the above. Excuse me for not knowing how to pronounce anything ever. So this novel follows 2 main characters, so Will and Rosie, and we meet them when they are teenagers. Rosie has a twin brother, and it is through her twin brother that herself and Will meet, because Rosie's twin brother is friends with Will. So we meet them as teenagers, and while they're both quite different people on paper, they develop a really deep connection, and what feels like it will be a very straightforward romance ends up being really complicated from the beginning, perhaps needlessly, but that doesn't matter, because that's not how this story is told. We kind of think they'll get together, but things keep happening to draw them apart, and then something incredibly life-altering happens that just really separates their lives altogether. So this all happens while they're teenagers, and it takes up quite a significant percentage of the book. I was a little bit unsure of it up to this part, because it just felt maybe a little bit juvenile, understandably so, because they're teenagers at the time. But once they kind of hit adulthood, I felt like this was where this book really came into its own. I had said to my partner that I didn't necessarily think this book was for me up to the point around where they hit adulthood, and then like it actually got going then, and I was like, oh, actually no, I really like this. They're both really frustrating characters. They make really frustrating decisions. There is definitely miscommunication, so if that is something that doesn't do it for you, don't go there. It's not as frustrating as Normal People in terms of miscommunication, in case you're wondering. Well, I didn't personally think so. As adults, they are drawn back together and they kind of start spending a lot of time talking to each other on the phone, which is, I guess, where the name of the book comes from, because they live kind of completely separate lives by this point. They aren't in the same geographical location, but they end up kind of building up this really intense bond again, basically picking up where they left off. But as adults, again, they're really kind of kept apart based on their own decisions and life and just everything in general. So this book touches on quite a few different topics, and I would definitely check trigger warnings before going in if there are topics out there that you find particularly upsetting. It is definitely a romance book, but it doesn't feel like the typical contemporary romance genre. It's more a kind of a literary book. The writing is actually really beautiful at times, so top marks for that. In hindsight, there were some lines that I really should have kind of underlined and I didn't, and I regret it now because I was too lazy to go get a pencil or a pen for myself. It was really sad in parts. I did shed a few tears, which normally is a sign that I'm really enjoying a book. Yeah, it's very readable. I did read this in essentially 2 sittings. Like, say I started it on a Monday and I read half it, and then Tuesday I didn't get to do any reading, and then Wednesday I finished it. If you've got a bit of a soft heart like myself and are a bit of a sucker for sad things like myself, then I'd recommend it. Where there are parallels to Normal People, I wouldn't say that they're very alike at all. I'd say that was just a marketing ploy to get me to buy it, and it worked. So if you are not a Normal People person, don't let that put you off. It's a good book. It's a really good book. It's not sitting up there in my favourites, but I did enjoy it. As I said, I found it a little bit when they were children, but I really enjoyed the characters as they came into their own as adults. Would recommend picking it up if it sounds like it might be your cup of tea. Right, the next book then that I read was an audiobook. I listened to this one quite compulsively. It was very intriguing. So before I get ahead of myself, this book was Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. And in this book, we follow a family from New York. So we have 2 parents, the adults, and then they have 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and they are off to stay in kind of a more rural part of New York, I believe, in an Airbnb for a week. You know how Airbnb works. They rent a house off some complete strangers and go to stay there. So as I've said, where they're staying is really rural. There aren't really any neighbours and there's no phone signal. They do have Wi-Fi, but no phone signal. They're relaxing peacefully for the first couple of days, having a nice time, everything's going well. And then one night, out of nowhere, there's a knock on the door. When they open the door, they find an elderly or older couple. They refer to them as old, and I actually think they're only in their 60s, which I think is doing people who are in their 60s an injustice. Not that getting old is an insult, in my personal opinion, but a lot of people seem to think it is. Shout out to you people who are lucky enough to live long, healthy lives. So anyway, we're getting off track here. So this couple have shown up at this door and they are complete strangers, but they claim to be the couple that this family are renting the Airbnb from, and they say that they have come because there's been a blackout in New York. There's absolutely no electricity. Nobody knows what's going on. Things are getting a little bit weird, and they decided that they wanted to be out of the city before things really hit the fan. And so they decided that they would go to this house where they knew that people were staying and ask, in the hopes that it would be okay that they could stay in their own house with them for a while till things kind of simmer down a bit and they figure out what's going on. Naturally, the family that are renting the house are quite reluctant. They're very suspicious of what's going on here, and they're a little bit like, oh, I don't know, my kids are here and I'm gonna have to let strangers stay in my house. They do manage to see something on the news that does suggest that they are telling the truth, and look, they decide to not turn them away. So it's kind of one of these books where you don't know who to trust. So you don't know if these strangers that come to the door are like the bad guys. We don't know if the couple who are renting the house are bad guys. You're just kind of suspicious of everybody and everything that's going on. So there's just this air of kind of creepiness to this book. It's very lonely. You get very much the sense that you're kind of very isolated here, and it did kind of remind me, like, it's completely different, but you know, Jordan Peele's Us definitely kept harking back to that in my brain. I was like, oh no, so that's probably potentially where I got the creepy sensation from. Maybe not. We don't really know who or what to believe because the phone and Wi-Fi have cut out, and so we don't even know if these people that have showed up on the doorstep are actually telling the truth anyway. So it's tense, it's bizarre, it's dystopian. There's some body horror, so watch out for that. There's lots of talk of animals, and there's also interesting commentary on gender roles and on race and on trust. This novel, I feel like there's definitely something in there about climate change as well. I wasn't sure what to expect going into this book. I didn't know if it was a horror or thriller or what it was, and to be honest with you, I still don't know, but I absolutely devoured that audiobook, which is something else because I'm not somebody for audiobooks so often. That's a ringing endorsement for it. I will say though, if you're the kind of person that feels let down by a book that doesn't give you all of the context, all of the answers, then this book is not for you. I enjoyed it, and I do understand why it's so well loved. For me personally, I thought it was okay, but I will say I absolutely devoured it while I was reading it, so that says a lot for the book as well. Next up was yet another modern classic, one I've been threatening to read for a very long time. That, of course, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So the story opens up in Monte Carlo, where we meet our unnamed protagonist. She is a young lady. She is about maybe 21 or so, and she's working as a companion to a wealthier older woman. And this older woman is kind of constantly trying to befriend like really wealthy, well-known people, and it's a bit of an embarrassment for our main character because you can see that she's a little bit too pushy and people tend to not like her all that much. But they do meet the handsome, enigmatic Maxim de Winter, and this is a man who's in his mid-40s, and the year prior to their meeting, his wife sadly passed away in an accident. And he is a man of means, and his home, Manderley, is really well known for being like beautiful and grand and full of wealth and all of that sort of grandeur and stuff that I know nothing about. So our unnamed protagonist becomes quite enamored with Maxim, and fortunately for her, her really annoying lady friend becomes sick for a week, and Maxim actually takes her out for the days and shows her around a little bit, and they get to know each other a little bit while her companion is down and out with sickness. So our young protagonist ends up falling for Maxim de Winter quite hard, but as readers we can see that he's actually quite evasive and quite elusive, and it feels as though he's holding his cards really closely to his chest, and you kind of start to wonder, is this man taking advantage of our little friend or what's going on? But anyway, when our older lady companion recovers, she decides that she wants to go back to America, and our little protagonist panics and runs up to Maxim's room and tells him what's going on, and kind of in a moment of, oh well, I guess we better do something about this, he asks our protagonist to marry him and asks her to come back to Manderley as his wife. So they enjoy their honeymoon traveling around Europe, but it's when we return to Manderley that the cracks really begin to show. So the echoes of Max's deceased wife are everywhere. Her name was Rebecca, and our protagonist, who is quite a timid young woman, struggles to make a place for herself in Manderley. So the same staff that were there when Rebecca was there are still there. Everybody remembers her. Her things are there. The house is decorated the way that Rebecca wanted it decorated, like everything, like her coats are still there, like with tissues in the pocket, and all of Rebecca's routines are still upheld by the staff and by the people in the house. Our protagonist naturally finds that a really difficult transition. What follows is a really strange and wonderfully written story about a young woman who's unsure, who's lonely, who's left kind of aloft and floating in a world that she's really unfamiliar with. I really felt for her, I won't lie. I don't want to say too much, but there's a reason that this book is a modern classic. There's a reason that this book is so well loved. The writing is like pen sharp. It's so contemporary to read as well. So just like We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, this book reads really well, like in terms of levels of contemporariness. I said that really backwards, but you get what I mean. and it's a very easy read. It feels very modern. It almost feels like historical fiction that was written today. If you feel like a little bit afraid of this book, there's no need to be afraid. It's really readable, and it actually winds up being a really interesting story that really devoured my attention for the time that I was reading it. So definitely another one for the list. I am like voraciously checking my notes here, you've probably noticed, because I don't remember what any of these books are about. I just remember how I felt about them. The next book then that I read in October was a sequel. So it was the third book in a series. So it was Age of War by Michael J. Sullivan, and it was the third book in the Legends of the First Empire series. So I think I started reading these books in summer. So for me to finish a trilogy that quickly, I'm really impressed with myself, because I like to read the first books in series and then never touch them again, no matter how much I enjoyed them. So this year I've been making a great effort to read the sequels in series. So anyway, back from my tangent, the Legends of the First Empire series is a 6-book series, but Michael J. Sullivan is an unusual author in that he writes his whole series pretty much before he publishes them, so he knows where he's going with every book before it's published. So he intended on writing a trilogy, but once he got to the end of this trilogy, which is Age of War, which is the book that I read in October, he felt like there's more to this story. I can't finish it here, so he wrote 3 more books. So this book does read like an ending of sorts, and I'm unsure where he's going to go with the next 3 books, but there's definitely a lot to follow on from this. I can tell myself. It's a really pastoral series. It is fantasy, and we follow an unlikely group of heroes. And what's great, what I love about this book, is that it really champions women as the heroes in the story, and we don't get that a lot in fantasy, so that's nice. So how this story starts out then, back in the first book, is essentially humans and fae live in this world, but they do not live together, they do not mix. They have a very tentative, like tumultuous agreement where they will live apart, and humans are to never travel onto the land that the fae have. And the fae seem to be a lot more wealthy, seems to have a lot more going for them, and the humans are kind of struggling a bit, and so there is a little bit of disparity there. But we start out where we follow 2 characters, and they're humans, and they cross the river onto the side where the fae are, and the fae come along and they're like, hey, what are you doing? This is our side, you're not supposed to be here. And whatever transpires is one of the humans ends up killing one of the fae, which is obviously not great for peace relations, but also it kind of throws things up in the air, because the humans used to look at the fae as if they were gods and if they were invincible, and you know, just this is completely like baffling, like this is new. But aside from that fun information, it sets off a series of events where a lot of people die, and you know, it's not great in that sense. So I can't say too much about Age of War, so this book in particular, because it is the third book in a trilogy, but I think that this one has been my favorite so far. I definitely did shed a few tears, which, as I've already mentioned, always a thumbs up from me. There's a little bit of romance, or not so much romance, but a little tickle of romance, if you will, in this one. And the characters, they're kind of delved into deeper again. The stakes are high, things feel really important. The characters are great. The character arcs are great, the plotting is great. I always really like Michael J. Sullivan's pacing in this series. I will say that I do think that the first book has been the slowest in the series for me personally, but I love a character driven book. Again, it's very much a plot driven book, but there's a lot of character work, which I really enjoy about Michael J. Sullivan's writing here. So I will say though, where I did really enjoy this book, I think because it is kind of a finale of sorts for the moment, I might just park reading it for a while and kind of go back to some of the other series that I've been neglecting that I actually own, because this is one I've been reading through my library. I really do want to prioritize not just series, but actually reading physical books from my own shelves, because as things stand, I have 114 books on my shelves that I haven't yet read. That's something I'm working on, I promise. So speaking of series, and of course last but very much not least, I read Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. I read Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which was the first book in the Farseer trilogy a couple months ago, and this is the second book in that trilogy, and I loved the first book as a high fantasy novel that somehow reads very character driven rather than plot driven. Really unusual, and I know that people do say that these books are very slow and yada yada yada, and I don't know, lads, I love that about these books. I feel like Robin Hobb's writing is really literary as well. It's really just can be such a slow burn, but also her writing is really clever. But I think where she really shines is her characters, and I am so pleased to be back with my beloved Fitz. Okay, so in this book there are some relationships that have become kind of more significant in Fitz's life since the first book, and then there is also kind of a brand new relationship that is incredibly significant. It's amazing. One of the relationships that is not a new one, but it has changed nature. Our Fitz is wrapped up in a little bit of a romance. One which, okay, I found myself able to get behind, but they have a lot of things going against them, and in the kind of challenges that they find, I did find that to be maybe a little bit repetitive sometimes. I'm like, okay, I get it. There's a lot of things standing in your way. There's a lot of reasons why you can't be together. Like, let's stop banging this out. But like, I mean, kind of realistic, isn't it? Like, if people feel like they can't be together, then they're going to keep trying to rehash it and trying to work out ways that they can be together. So I don't know that I can really criticize that. Like, it is a very futile situation with no kind of fully satisfactory conclusions that they can see, so in many ways it was done very well. I just did find myself a little bit bored of it, but like not terribly so. Otherwise, Fitz is caught up in a bond with this new character that wasn't in the first novel, and I loved this relationship in particular. It embodied so much of what I loved about the first book, and I don't even want to say what that is because I don't want to give away anything about this. Like, if you're going to read this, I loved this guy, and it's just a relationship that is actually really incredibly important to the overarching story of the book. So I think where Robin Hobb really shines is within her writing of relationships, how people balance against and bounce off of each other. There are some really interesting political maneuvers here, but it's also really incredibly easy to follow, so don't worry about that if you find yourself as somebody who really struggles to follow kind of political points, because it's very readable, and I feel like you get to know the characters so well that you can follow really quite well what's going on as well. So this book in particular was 600 plus pages. Unusually for me, I felt myself ready to just go into the third book immediately, and that book is even longer. I think it's about 900 pages. Which is something that I never do with series. I tend to take a break and jump from book to book and different series to different series, just so that I don't get bored of the same story and the same characters and so on and so forth. But I think it's a real testament for Robin Hobb's writing and her characterization for me to say I really want to stick with these characters. Now, I didn't, because I wanted to kind of get through some of the rest of my TBR as well, so I parked it, but I do feel like I'm going to read it really soon because I want to know how this trilogy concludes. It left me with quite a bit of a book hangover as well, which is something that I don't necessarily always get from a fantasy book. Cannot wait to see what Robin Hobb does with these characters and this story, because it is phenomenal. Like, honestly, I will say that it's not going to be for everybody because it's fantasy, but it's also not going to be for every fantasy reader because it's a lot slower and doesn't necessarily follow all of the same tropes. Like, we do have our chosen one, Fitz, and there are a lot of familiar tropes, but it reads differently than your regular fantasy book. That's all I'm gonna say about that. So there we go, there you have it. Those are the 7 books that I managed to finish in October. There wasn't a bad one among the bunch. Some I definitely loved more than others, but in saying that, there also weren't any 5-star books. That's probably just because I'm stingy with my 5 stars, as you might know. Let me know, what did you read in October? What are you reading for November? Anything good? Anything you want to recommend? As if I need any more books on my list to get around to. I always do. I hope you're doing really well. I hope you're minding yourself, and I look forward to catching up with you again next week in another video. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.